Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the state of Florida, which is a state we really haven't talked about much this midterm cycle because frankly, both of the races, the Senate and governorship, haven't really been that competitive. But if current polls are to be believed, it looks like the GOP could end up winning both of these races by double digits. So we're going to be taking a look at some of the polling data for both of these races. We're going to take a look at some previous Florida election results that would indicate whether or not this shift to the right makes sense. And then, of course, we're going to analyze some of the early vote because some of the takeaways from it are very interesting, and Republicans are leading in typical Democratic strongholds like Miami-Dade and even Palm Beach County. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. Of course, link down below to our election night live stream. Set your reminders down below. We'll be streaming all throughout the night. I'll have a couple of guests on as well. And we'll also be launching the channel's Discord in just a couple of days, so stay tuned for that. So anyway, let's get straight into it. First, we'll start off with the Senate race in Florida, which I honestly thought would be more of a layup for Marco Rubio. Currently, he's up by about 6.4%. Again, Republicans typically have been underestimated in Florida polling in the past, so I wouldn't be surprised if Rubio wins by a larger margin than this. The latest polls actually have Rubio up by 11%, according to University of North Florida. Data for Progress has him up by 7 points. So still really large margins for a Republican overall. Of course, Marco Rubio is sort of an electoral juggernaut in the state of Florida. So to see him actually running behind DeSantis is interesting. It's not something I would have seen coming. But I guess because DeSantis is more of a local figure, he's the governor of the state, more people are willing to vote for him and cross the aisle than for Marco Rubio, which I guess really is the reason why you're starting to see this switch. Also, I would argue Ron DeSantis is a stronger candidate than Marco Rubio. He's more charismatic. He can point to his accomplishments as governor of Florida, which I think has more appeal to independents than somebody like Marco Rubio, who is just, some are in the Senate. So looking at these polls so far, Val Demings is polling anywhere from 41 to 43%, depending on which aggregate you look at. She was never going to win this race. Of course, this is Florida. This is Marco Rubio, a very strong candidate. Of course, we can go back to the 2016 election, where Marco Rubio essentially had a layup victory against his opponent, the Democrat. He got really close in Miami-Dade County compared to Trump. Again, Trump lost Miami-Dade County by 30 points. Marco Rubio only lost it by 11. Did really well in Duval County. All of these areas where Donald Trump underperformed in these suburban parts of Florida, Marco Rubio was doing better. Essentially all across the board, Marco Rubio did better than Trump in basically all of these counties. He saw a nearly 8-point margin of victory when Donald Trump on the exact same ballot only won the state of Florida by about 1.2%. So really a big swing, a lot of Democrats voting for Marco Rubio, and certainly a decent chunk of independents as well. So now in 2016, you had Florida voting to the right of the nation by about 3 points. It went to Donald Trump by 1.2%. Of course, in the year 2018, where Democrats were doing exceptionally well around the entire country, they were flipping governorships, they were taking back Senate seats, you would expect a state like Florida, which voted so narrowly for President Trump, to actually swing towards the Democrats like a lot of these other states did. And that wasn't the case. Of course, Ron DeSantis, who was polling behind Andrew Gillum, in some cases by 11 points in certain polls, pulled a huge upset victory in Florida. And one of the reasons why that was the case was because Florida was trending to the right, and it was sort of the first indication of that. And it's one of the main reasons why I had Donald Trump winning Florida in my 2020 prediction, where a lot of people had Florida going narrowly to Joe Biden, was because this was clearly an indication of a trend further to the right. Now, Florida is normally immune to some of these wave years. Of course, candidates like Rick Scott always tend to win by a point or so. We saw that in 2014, which was a huge red wave year around the country. So in some ways, Florida is sort of immune to some of these national trends. But in this case in particular, this is certainly something that stands out because by all intents and purposes, Andrew Gillum should have won this governor's race. All of the polls had him ahead. The blue wave environment was manifesting around the country, and yet ultimately, at the end of the day, we really didn't see that happen. Now, what was interesting enough as well was also the Senate seat flipped. Incumbent Senator Bill Nelson narrowly lost his reelection to Rick Scott, who won by 0.2%. And, Rick Scott did better than Ron DeSantis in a lot of these suburban counties. I think he sort of fell off more in some of the rural areas where DeSantis was doing slightly better than Rick Scott. Bill Nelson had slightly more enthusiasm there. But overall, this is really an indication that Florida was sort of bucking the national trends and moving towards the right. And I think the real nail in the coffin for the Democrats was the 2020 election, when the state of Florida went to Donald Trump by over 3 percentage points in a year where, quite frankly, that should not have happened. Florida voted to the right of the nation by 7 points, the nation going to Joe Biden by about 4 points, 4.5. You have Donald Trump winning the state by over 3. So this was really a big indication that Florida, I think, was changing direction. Now, Florida does have a tendency to vote more in favor of the incumbent president. We saw that in the 2004 election with George W. Bush, and then we saw that in 1996 where Bill Clinton flipped the state of Florida, a state that George H.W. Bush had narrowly won 4 years earlier. So in some cases, Florida does have a history of breaking for the incumbent in re-election years, but nothing really explains the massive shifts we saw in Miami-Dade County if it were not for the trends of Florida moving to the right overall. The Hispanic voting bloc in Florida moving more towards the right, Cuban voters moving more towards the right, and Latinos overall trending more in Republicans' direction. And according to the polling that we're seeing out of the governor's race as well, this isn't a trend that appears to be letting up. Ron DeSantis is currently up by 10 points according to RCP. The RCP average is very accurate usually in predicting these races. Normally it's only off by a couple of points, but either way, these polls are well without the margin of error. Charlie Crist is expected to lose by a pretty decent margin. My previous predictions had Ron DeSantis up by about 8 points, but if he's polling at 10% on RCP, and if that surge continues, we could very well see Ron DeSantis win the state of Florida by a safe margin over 12 percentage points, which is something I never thought was possible, even in such a red wave environment. But given the fact that we saw Florida go about 7 points to the right of the nation in 2020, it really shouldn't shock us all that much then if Ron DeSantis does end up winning by 12 points or more. Again, Florida is one of those states that the Democratic Party has really dropped the ball in. Republicans have been really competent as of late. I mean, the fact that they were able to flip a Senate seat and hold on to the governorship in 2018 is really a testament to the gains that the Republican Party has made in Florida and these Latino shifts that we've been seeing around the country, but really mainly in the Sun Belt and places like Florida, where we're likely to see a landslide victory from both Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio. Now, if I were to bet on the margins today, I would say Ron DeSantis probably wins by about 12 points. Marco Rubio wins by 10. Now, there is a large undecided factor in this aggregate overall, about 8 points going in favor of other. Ron DeSantis is only at 50%. But I think a lot of these undecideds are going to break for DeSantis, one, because of the national environment, and two, he is a popular incumbent governor. Now, something very noteworthy about these elections in Florida is that the Commissioner of Agriculture, Nikki Fried, is not running for re-election because she decided to run for governor and got destroyed by Charlie Crist in the Democratic primary. We are on track for the Republican Party to have all offices in Florida, both statewide and federal, since just after the Civil War. That's over 150 years of a Democrat occupying some statewide or Senate seat since really the 1870s. That's 150 years of history in the making for the Republican Party, and they're almost certainly going to pull it off this time around. So this just goes to show you how red the state of Florida has gotten and how this state really isn't a swing state anymore. Now, I know we're talking about a red wave environment. The fact that Florida was voting for the Republicans in 2020, where states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona and Georgia were going for the Democrats, that really indicates that there is a more permanent shift in Florida's politics than just the back and forth that we have in these typical election cycles. Now, the last thing I want to take a look at is the early and absentee vote models by Target Smart, their Target Early forecaster. Now, we're 10 days out from Election Day, and as of right now, Republicans are leading in the early and absentee vote as compared to 2020. Of course, in 2020, Democrats had 43% of their registered voters returning their ballots, and of course, Republicans had just 35%. Now we're looking at Democrats at 40%, Republicans at 41%. Of course, if we take a look at modeled party and not registered party, you're going to get a little bit different of a result. Republicans actually lead by a very similar amount. Democrats at 46, Republicans at 47. Remember, Republicans are the demographic that tend to vote on Election Day. So the fact that they're leading in the early vote really does indicate, I think, a really massive landslide for the Republican Party in both the Senate and governorships. Again, Florida is a state where a lot of Northeastern conservatives have been moving to, especially since the pandemic. People from New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, even states like Maryland, they've all been moving down to Florida because it's more affordable and it's an area that fosters their conservative values. And I think the lockdowns during COVID in a lot of these blue states really accelerated the red trend we've been seeing in Florida, because Florida, demographically speaking, should be a blue state. When you take a look at the racial demographics, the percentage of Latinos, white voters, black voters, this really should be a blue state. But because Hispanic voters are voting for the Republican Party by much larger margins, the fact that we're likely to see record numbers of African American men voting for the Republican Party this year, it just goes to show you that in some cases, demographics isn't always destiny in some states like Florida, where you've really cobbled together a very unique Republican coalition. And I think that exact coalition is going to bring both Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio to landslide margins of victory at the end of the day. I think Rubio wins by 10. I think DeSantis wins by 12. So something really, really interesting. We never thought Florida was going to get this red. I think earlier on in the cycle, these were more likely races. We actually thought that DeSantis was probably going to win by a likely margin, Rubio by a safe margin. Now it seems like those are reversed, and those numbers are likely to bear out on election day. So anyway, thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed, leave a thumbs up. Of course, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe down below. The link below will have our election night live stream. Please set your reminder. We're anticipating a really big election night. We're going to have a couple of guests on the channel to analyze these results, so stay tuned for that. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.